C# is a language that is built by Microsoft for working with Microsoft's .NET application platforms. It is a language that's very similar to other languages you may have seen, such as JavaScript or Java or C, C++, Objective-C. If you've used any of these languages in the past, you're going to feel right at home pretty much in C#. Syntactically, the language is very similar. C# is what's called a managed code environment. Memory management is automatic. So if you've worked with other languages like C or Objective-C, then you've probably come across situations where you have to create and destroy objects on your own. C# does all of that for you. When you create an object, the C# interpreter or compiler actually takes care of making sure that that memory is returned to the system at some point, and you don't have to worry about it. C# is a compiled language. Unlike some other languages you may be familiar with, like JavaScript or Perl, you must first build a C# program before you can run it. And this step is called compiling the application. JavaScript and Perl are interpreted languages. In other words, the execution engine, in the case of JavaScript, for example, that would be the browser, actually interprets the language line by line as it goes through the program and runs it as it discovers new statements and other things in the language. C# isn't like that. In C#, you write your code, then you have to go through the compilation step, and then you can run the application. Now, at its heart, C# is an object-oriented programming language. In C#, pretty much almost everything can be treated as an object. I've underlined the word almost there because there are a couple of esoteric cases where not everything is an object. But for our purposes in this course, you can pretty much think that everything in C# is an object and can be treated that way. In fact, in C# there are no global functions or variables. Everything is in classes. And that might be different from other languages you might be familiar with, like JavaScript or like C. But in C#, everything has to be inside of a class, and we'll come across that as we go further into the language. Now, as I mentioned earlier, C# is a foundation for working with many different Microsoft platform technologies. At the bottom of the stack is something called the Common Language Runtime. This is the execution engine or virtual machine or whatever you want to call it that actually interprets all the various bytes that the program gets compiled down to and is what runs your code. On top of that are the Microsoft .NET Framework libraries. This is code that is provided to you by .NET that performs a whole bunch of common things that applications have to do, such as reading and writing from files, working with the web, and all that kind of stuff. That's all contained in the .NET Framework libraries. On top of that is the C# language, which we'll be working with today. But the thing about .NET is that it was designed to work with lots of languages. There are other languages like VB.NET, such as Visual Basic or Python and so on, but we're not going to concentrate on those. We're going to be using C# throughout this course. What this allows you to do is use one language to target many different platforms. So using C# and .NET, you can build applications that will run on Windows, Windows Phone, Silverlight, SharePoint, ASP.NET, Xbox, and a whole bunch of others. So just by learning this one language, you can build applications that run in many, many different places. C# got its start way back in 2001. This was when Microsoft released the first version of .NET, that was .NET 1.0. That was where C# burst onto the scene. And it continued along for a couple of happy years until 2003 came along, which was when Microsoft released .NET version 1.1. And that was when C# 1.2 was released. Not a whole lot of different changes between the initial C# release and 1.2, a couple of cleaning up things they did in the language. But 2005 is when things began to get interesting. That was when .NET 2.0 came out, and .NET 2.0 introduced some neat little things into C#, things like generics and anonymous methods and iterators and nullable types. Some of these things are advanced, and we won't be covering them in this course. But we will be looking at things like nullable types a little bit later on. In 2007, that was when .NET 3.0 was released, and in .NET 3.0 along came C# 3.0, which introduced concepts such as object initializers, anonymous types, and so on. Again, some of these are advanced, like lambda expressions. We won't be looking at those, but we will be using things like object initializers later on. And then that brings us to 2010, which was when the .NET 4.0 framework was released, and along came C# 4.0, with things like dynamic binding and named and optional arguments. And we'll be, again, as You may have detected by now a bit of a pattern. We will be looking at some of those later on in the course. Now, as I mentioned earlier, C# is a compiled language, and that means a couple of things. In C#, you have to declare your variables before you use them. There's no way around this. You have to actually say, here's the variable I'm going to use, and I have to say what type it is. Now, if you're used to a language like JavaScript, you simply use the keyword var to declare a variable in JavaScript, and you can also do that in the newer versions of C#. But we're not going to be doing that now. We're going to see how typing actually works. So when you declare a variable, you have to supply a type and supply a name. So for example, I'd say int myCounter or string message. In this case, myCounter is an integer variable for integer numbers, and the message variable is a string. The reason you have to do this is because it helps the C# compiler optimize the program for knowing what kinds of data it's going to work with. It doesn't have to figure it out on the fly. You can also initialize variables when you first declare them. I could have written, for example, int myCounter equals 200, or string message equals hello world. And this assigns an initial value to the variable when it is declared. The other thing you need to know about C# is the concept of namespaces. Again, other languages have something like this. In Java, you may have seen something like packages. JavaScript doesn't really have something like this. There are some efforts to kind of fake it up using things called modules. But a namespace is basically just a way to organize a bunch of information into classes. And .NET uses namespace to organize all the classes that it provides for you. Essentially, it's a way of naming related classes and other namespaces within the namespace such that you can group them together into logical formations that make sense for various pieces of functionality. And to take an example, .NET provides a namespace called System, which we will be using a lot in this course. And inside System, there will be classes such as Console and Environment and Math and so on. So each of those little boxes there represent classes, and the keyword System represents the namespace. And in fact, you and your applications can create their own namespaces, and we'll see that a little bit later in the course when we start creating our own applications. But this is an important concept to understand. C# and .NET in general uses namespaces to organize classes. And this is how applications get organized, and it makes things a lot easier when you're writing your code in C#.